Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Welcome to today's Zoom on the U.S. Korea agenda after the U.S. elections. Today's program is brought to you by the Consulate General of Korea in Atlanta and the Atlanta Global Studies Center led by Dr. Tony Lemieux, who's co-founder. I'm going to ask the audience to first listen to the speakers before you start sending questions, but send questions and make them concise, please, via the question function on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, not the chat, the questions function. And if you want me to ask your question, do not send it in anonymously. Our guests today are Mark Lippert, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea, and Mike Green, Associate Professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And before we start with the guest, I hope Consul General Kim is there. Here he is, Consul General Kim.
Hello.
Good morning. Welcome.
Yeah.
And I hope you're gonna welcome us all.
Yeah. Thank you for Ambassador Shapiro for your kind introductions. Ambassador Lippert, very nice to meet you. And Dr. Green, very nice to meet you again. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. As some of you might remember, every year, Korean Consulate in Atlanta and the WAC Atlanta host a conference with a large audience to talk about Korea-US relations or Korean Peninsula issues. Due to the current COVID pandemic, however, this year's conference is obliged to be held online. I'm nevertheless confident that today's event is really important and meaningful in terms of its timing and topic. Korean President Moon Jae-in spoke with the US President-elect Joe Biden yesterday by phone and congratulated him on his election. According to the Korean President's office, President Moon and the President-elect Biden reaffirmed their firm commitment to our great alliance and peaceful and prosperity Korean Peninsula. President-elect described Korea as the linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region and promised to maintain the US defense commitment to South Korea and to work closely with the Korean government on resolving the North Korean nuclear issue. President Moon and President-elect Biden also agreed that the two countries should expand cooperations in global issues, including COVID-19 and climate change. To that end, the Korean government will communicate through various channels with the President-elect's team to make sure that there won't be any gap in strengthening the alliance and coordinating toward the lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula and the denuclearization during the transitional period. For that reason, I believe today's webinar would provide a valuable opportunity for friends here and the people in Georgia to reflect on the importance of our alliance and facilitate ideas of how to move toward peace on the Korean Peninsula and beyond in the years to come. Last but not least, today's events have been possible through close collaboration between Korean Consulate and the WAC Atlanta. I'd like to use this opportunity to extend my deepest appreciation to Ambassador Shapiro and his team for their preparation and hard work. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Lippert and Dr. Green, who will be sharing knowledge, experiences, insight to make our great alliance more solid and robust. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Consul General. That was terrific and glad we can start. And I'm going to ask you to please mute your camera and your microphone now, if you will. I'm going to introduce our guests. Mark Lippert was the U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. The White House said that Ambassador Lippert leaves Seoul as the most popular U.S. ambassador in the history of U.S. Korea relations. This reflects his effectiveness in advancing U.S. interests while simultaneously strengthening bonds between the two countries. He's had a whole bunch of other assignments, which I'm not going to run through for everybody, except to mention that he was awarded the Bronze Star for his service with the U.S. Navy in Iraq. Since 2017, Ambassador Lippert has been the Vice President for International Affairs at Boeing. Our other guest today is Dr. Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington. He served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 to 2005. And according to knowledgeable people, more important than all of that, he was the pipe major of the City of Washington Bagpipe Band. So, Ambassador Lippert, let me start with you. On Monday, the Washington Post had a headline that said, North Korea watches Biden victory with one finger on the missile test trigger. Is that your assessment? Should we expect some sort of North Korean provocation between now and inauguration or early in the new administration?
Well, first, let me say, great to be here. Great to be virtually in the city of Atlanta. My sister is an Emory alum, which she shared with former Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea, Lee Hong-gol, right, who's a very famous Emory alum dating back to the 50s and one of my all-time favorite Korean political figures. So Lee Hong-gol, sorry, I mispronounced a little early here where I am. So with that, the other thing I will just say is that very kind passage that you read about me early about the most effective ambassador, that was actually written by Mike Green.
You're kidding.
Jongang Ilbo op-ed. So I'm forever indebted to Dr. Green for his kind words and his great musical talents, which I've enjoyed personally. So with that, let me also just quickly say I am speaking only on behalf of myself as a private citizen, no other institution or affiliation. So let me, on this question, I think it's a very interesting question. It's one that has been hotly debated by North Korean experts. If past practice is an indicator, the North generally does something between election day and the first 100, 200 days of a new administration. And that generally is to try to do something provocative to elevate their issue on the agenda of the United States president's friends, allies around the world. So I think that's point one. Past practice does tend to indicate that. The second point, though, however, is the calculation is more complicated, I think, for the North this time around. One, we've been through a series of unprecedented summits. Two, that have changed the I would say the landscape that North Korea faces in kind of a strange bilateral way with the United States. Two, the second point is the North Koreans are really under pressure at this point in time. They have broad United Nations sectoral sanctions applied against their economy. They are a bit leaky at times. There's cheating, all of that, but they're still strong sanctions. Started under Obama, continued under Trump, and these are sanctions that go well beyond previous sanctions that were only limited to the WMD, weapons of mass destruction programs, and some missile and components related programs. So those sanctions are in place. The economic downturn that the world has faced with COVID has hurt the North in terms of its hard currency reserves and trade with China. And the North also experienced some natural disasters this summer that have further impacted it. In response to COVID as well, the North Koreans have really crushed their own internal economy. They have shut down markets. They have squeezed traditional coping mechanisms that helped people mitigate some of the sanctions and lack of hard currency. So my assessment is that they are under some pressure to come back to the negotiating table. Final point on all of this is that then the calculation is, are they better off doing something provocative in the near term? And I think some like Victor Cha, Mike's colleague at CSIS, believe that they probably will revert to form. Or do they realize that they are in a different environment? And will they try to forestall or delay some action to see if they can get some sort of bilateral or multilateral conversation going with the Biden administration and or the rest of the world? And I'll just exit by saying there is a lot, North Korean experts will tell you that there is a lot of policy rigidity in their system, in that they tend to fall back and be relatively flexible on questions like these. So that augurs for some sort of provocation. At the same time, I guess what I would say is there is a pretty obvious roadmap here. If they do something overly provocative, the Biden administration could go to the UN, could go to the Chinese, make life even tougher on the North Koreans, make bilateral negotiations or talks with the United States and or partners in the region more distant, and forestall or delay their goal, which is sanctions relief and their immediate goals of sanctions relief and hard currency inject into the economy. And I'll stop there.
U.S. media tends to focus on North Korea much more than South Korea, but of course, because of the threat from North Korea. But I'd like to talk about South Korea for a moment. They're in this strange position where they've got this powerful ally with whom they do not always see eye to eye. And questions about the peace treaty with North Korea and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Can you talk about that a minute? Were President Moon and Trump out of sync? Are President Moon and President-elect Biden likely to see more eye to eye?
So great point up front, Ambassador. Incredibly astute. I'll just say an anecdote. I would be sitting in my office as ambassador from time to time, more often than I care to admit, entertaining groups of academics, NGOs, other people coming through Seoul, and I would get 10 questions, 8.5 of which would be about North Korea. And I would say, you do realize you are sitting in one of the most dynamic, consequential, important countries in the world right here in the Republic of Korea, number one. And number two, arguably the most spectacular democratic and development model in the history of the world. And finally, as we now perhaps know a little better, a cultural powerhouse around the world in terms of pop culture, in terms of historic, history and more what you call jantan culture, traditional culture. So there is no doubt in my mind that we should pay much more attention to South Korea in and of itself. That dovetails with, I think, a practicality of policymaking in Northeast Asia, which is a good, solid U.S.-ROC alliance bilateral relationship is critical to successful outcomes in Northeast Asia. And
okay, I'm going to stop you for a minute. Yeah. I'm going to stop you. ROC is Republic of Korea, so everybody's got it.
Exactly. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Exactly. I did work at the Pentagon, so I fall back into acronyms from time to time, so apologies. Is incredibly important to policymaking in Northeast Asia, but also increasingly, really under Mike's leadership during his time at the White House, President Bush and Lee Bak started Global Korea, a more global bilateral relationship that started to tackle global issues. So you see the multivariate, multidimensional elements of this relationship and the positive force it can have. I think to the final point, and we can get into this a little bit more, that is a requisite or a reason why you have to have good alliance management. And it's something, Mike, I'll parrot a line from him. You never get enough credit for it in Washington and Seoul. Alliance managers do not get enough credit. They do all of this hard work to keep the relationship on track. And there are a host of thorny issues in this relationship. The countries, you're right, do not agree on everything, nor should they. They're different countries. You're going to have disagreements, but how you manage those disagreements, where you find common ground, and then moreover, where you work together, like I referenced earlier, to expand the relationship, either globally into different functional areas, bringing in new constituencies, is critically important for the bilateral relationship. And then just to circle back on the final point, and then all of the positive developments that flow from that, Northeast Asia, global, all of that good stuff comes from strong alliance management between Washington and Seoul. And I'll stop there.
And how have we done in the past 4 years?
I would say it's been interesting in that I keep stealing people's lines here, but I think what you've have is a Blue House that is very focused on the North Korea issue. They want to get inter-Korean relations back on track. They want to get something that Moon Jae-in talks about a lot, the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, back on track. So I think the Blue House has been very pleased with these personal summits between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. And we can have a longer conversation about the results and efficacy of all of that. But I think for the point of the relationship, that has been something that they've been very interested and very pleased about. On the other hand, there have been a lot of issues in terms of trade, especially with unilateral trade remedies, such as the 232 action, which is a trade remedy by the United States imposed for national security issues. Largely, I'm oversimplifying. That is a major issue in the relationship, has been.
So that's tariffs on South Korean steel.
Exactly. And potentially cars too, right? That's the other thing. You can declare if there are certain actions undertaken in the Washington, D.C. policymaking process, irrespective of the South Korean views, you can impose tariffs. So that has been an issue. The other part, there have been issues over burden sharing, which has gotten a lot of headlines in that's how much each side.
Yeah, burden. Yeah, I want you to unpack burden sharing and explain what that means. So.
Well, I was going there, absolutely. But you're keen to steer the ship in that direction. Yeah. So I say that as a former Navy officer. Burden sharing is essentially how much the two countries agree to pay to host United States soldiers in the Republic of Korea. That's an oversimplification. By and large, the Koreans pay between 50 and 55% of the non-personnel costs. And every 5 years, there is a renewal of this agreement to update it, refresh it, negotiate. And over time, the South Koreans have tended to pay more as costs have gone up. That's one point. And the second point I would just add, that is in addition to being a very generous ally. And let me just tick off a couple boxes there because I don't think they're well understood. The biggest U.S. overseas military base at a cost of $10 billion, of which the South Koreans paid 92 to 96% of, is in South Korea. The South Koreans have a mandatory draft. Every military age male, with a very limited number of exceptions, serves at some of the most productive times in their working lives. So these are real economic costs, in addition to the sacrifices these individuals make away from their families and derailing their careers, or not derailing, but interrupting civilian careers. They purchase 90 to 95% of U.S. military equipment in terms of their procurement. There are big ticket items that are procured from the South Koreans, F-35s, P-8s, for example, big platforms. So I could go on and on, but very, very generous and very, very robust allies in terms of costs and burden sharing, in addition to this more limited agreement. So that is an issue that there has been a lot of back and forth. The agreement has expired. President Trump demanded a massive, unprecedented increase. Interestingly enough, if you believe press reporting, the State Department at the secretary level and the South Koreans at the cabinet minister essentially came to an agreement that does include a substantial increase, but was rejected by the president himself. So that's all a long way of saying that I do think that this has been a real problem from the standpoint that what these issues have done has taken the relationship, overly focused it on a handful of thorny issues, gotten us distracted from the broader agenda. Not to say these aren't important issues, but the amount of time, attention, and resources being spent on them is not commensurate with the other issues that are going on in an environment with a rising China, in an environment of COVID, in an environment of a dynamic economic situation, the alliance needs to be focused on these bigger issues as well and manage through these issues. Final point I would say is the good news is I do think there is, for an incoming Biden administration, an ability to pick up some of these issues like the burden sharing agreement. There's a pretty good deal on the table. Feels like you can make quick work of that. There's some stuff on the trade side. I think the Koreans would be wise to look hard at regulatory reform to get the U.S. business community, I think, more motivated about the relationship, and attract some FDI to help solve youth unemployment in South Korea as well, or underemployment. So there's a whole host of things that I think are there. They're extant. You can seize on pretty quickly to really rev up the relationship in the short term, and then start working through some of the thornier issues that will inevitably arise in this relationship as they have over the past 70 plus years, or 60 plus years. Sorry, going on 70.
That's great. Thanks, Ambassador Lippert. Professor Green, what do you disagree? Tell me where's Mark Lippert wrong?
Yeah, well, I have to begin by clarifying one thing. When Ambassador Lippert left Korea and I wrote my article in Jungang Global, I said the most effective diplomat in the history of U.S. Korea relations was Mark Lippert's dog, Grigsby. But the editors cut that part out. And if you know anything about Ambassador Lippert, he was incredibly effective, but he got some unconventional help from his dog and then his baby, who were rock stars in Korea, which I resented because his dog more than once took my dinner off my plate when we were together with friends. He did a remarkable job. And, you know, I worked as the principal advisor for John McCain on Asia in 2008. Mark worked for then candidate Obama. You would be hard pressed to find differences between Republicans and Democrats on U.S. Korea relations right now. It's never, the bipartisanship has never been stronger. The public opinion polls, we've done them at CSIS, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, show the highest level of support in the US for defending Korea and working with Korea ever. And very high, thanks to Ambassador Lippert, very high support for the alliance, very high support in Korea. We have a joint and combined alliance. So if you've been in the Pentagon, as Mark and I have, and you go into the bunkers in Korea, you see American and Korean officers sitting side by side, and if there's a war, they will command each other. They trust each other that much. They've prepared that much. You don't see that anywhere else in Asia. A little bit with Australia, but there's no joint and combined command. So it's a remarkable alliance, and I think people on both sides of the aisle recognize that. You know, if President Trump got a second term, we would be talking about different things right now. There was real concern that he was going to pressure Korea on this burden sharing issue, and then walk away and pull US troops home. And there was so much concern about this that the people who wrote legislation to prevent that in Washington were actually Lindsey Graham, Dan Sullivan, Joni Ernst, Tom Cotton. It was the Republicans who were worried about what their own president would do and who support the alliance. So that is, you know, with a slightly different outcome. Maybe some people think we don't have an outcome yet. That is what we might have been debating right now. I think that's off the table because even if, you know, all eyes will be on Georgia, but no matter who wins in Georgia in January, and God help everyone in Georgia, you're going to be deluged with political ads. No matter who wins, there is a pretty robust bipartisan consensus on this issue. Between a Biden administration and a Republican Senate, if there is one, Democrats in Congress. But there are some concerns, I think, just, you know, we would not be experts on foreign policy if we didn't worry about something. And there are three areas, I think, and I'd be interested in Mark's reaction. One is, you know, there is a gap between how the Blue House views the North Korea diplomacy and how a Biden administration will probably view it.
I'm going to stop you. Just the Blue House is the Korean counterpart to the White House, right? It's the presidential center. Yeah,
because it has a blue roof, not because of their attitude or their mood. So the Blue House, the Korean White House, they want a summit. They would really like nothing more than for Joe Biden to meet with Kim Jong-un, and it seems pretty clear to me Joe Biden is not going to do that. in part because if he did, it would be red meat for Republicans, and he's not
Yeah.
going to use his political capital on that. So there's a bit of a gap there. Second issue is there's a gap on Japan. And if we're going to deal with North Korea effectively, we've got to have a U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral front. And relations
And there are traditional problems between Japan and Korea.
they ebb and flow. They come and go. They're up and down. Right now, they're really down. Relations are really quite bad for a variety of reasons we can go into. The best way, and I think Mark would agree, to deal with that for the United States is to work together trilaterally. But Seoul and Tokyo may expect the Biden administration to intervene on their behalf to deal with the other side, which I think would be a mistake, but it's very, very delicate diplomacy. And then the third one, which really overhangs the first two and is quite significant, I think, is while the US and Korean political leadership, the publics, the militaries are very, very strong on our alliance. You know, the motto of the US Korea alliance is "Kachikapchida," we go together. And it's really true. On North Korea. The other motto of US forces is "we fight tonight." And our forces with the Koreans are ready to fight tonight if they have to. Problem is China. And, you know, Mark alluded to this a bit, but the Korean and American view of China is not so different. The same number of Koreans say China's a threat as the number of Americans who say China's a threat. But the American strategy, and this will be true for Biden too, is let's shape the region. Let's build partnerships with India and Japan and Australia. Let's push back against China in the South China Sea. That's not something Korean diplomats have traditionally done, not for 2,000 years. They're stuck next to China on the continent. They need China for North Korea. And Korean strategists are very reluctant to get caught in the US-China competition. But that's a problem for our alliance, because right now I'm quite confident the Biden administration will be very focused on lining up allies. Now, I think they'll be more subtle about what they ask Korea to do. And I think they'll be smart and look at what Korea can do, because on democracy, on technology, especially 5G and Samsung, on diplomacy, on development assistance, on investment, Korea is quite influential in South and Southeast Asia and has a lot to offer. But Seoul's going to be very hesitant to make it about China, and will stand out in that sense compared to Japan or India or Canada or Australia or most of our other allies and partners. And that's awkward and difficult. So these are not existential problems for the U.S. Korea alliance, but they're going to take some really deft diplomacy that, to my mind, so far only Grigsby, Mark Lippert's dog, has been capable of. So we may have to bring him back to Seoul. I don't know if he's enjoying retirement, Mark, but we may need Grigsby again for our alliance, because these are not easy issues.
Mark, you want to respond to that?
Yes. The paramount issue is Grigsby, our basset hound, is ready. He's, anyway, so there's three big buckets here, I think. And let me just take one that I think is not probably the least understood, is the difference between inter-Korean talks and negotiations and nuclear disarmament and that bucket, right? Because everybody sees the nuclear issue in terms of the UN sanctions. The people go back a couple of decades, think about the six-party talks, think about the Leap Day deal that Obama had, and then President Trump, the summits, right? That's the nuclear disarmament negotiation piece of this. There is a separate but important and sometimes linked element to this between the two Koreas. And when the progressives who are in power now are ascendant, they really put a lot of emphasis on that channel. And that channel basically there's a premium on Koreans talking to Koreans and trying to make progress through that channel. In addition to, there are some really important humanitarian elements in there in terms of family reunions, humanitarian aid. And so those pieces can sometimes be complementary, but they can also come into conflict. And an early thing to watch is how the two sides in Washington and Seoul manage, sequence, and otherwise drive these two tracks that are related but distinct at times, and are incredibly important as well.
Great. Let me remind people it's time to send in questions and send it via the question function, not via chat, please. But before we go to the questions, I mean, this is sort of a toss-up for both of you. We had former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry on a program a couple of months ago, and he just said, man, Korea was so unbelievably difficult. And we know that in the conversation that President-elect Trump had with outgoing President Obama 4 years ago this week, if I'm not mistaken, that was President Obama's warning to President Trump. Who's done this right? How do we get this back on track? I mean, is just North Korea impossible to deal with?
Mike, you want to go first on that, or I can take it?
Well, I'm tempted to answer your question, who's done this right, by answering North Korea, because they're the ones who now have nuclear weapons, despite all our efforts. But that's not really a good answer, because they've done it right if the goal was to have nuclear weapons. They haven't done it right if the goal is to feed their people, and to care for their people and to grow their economy. They've done that completely wrong. And it's, the North Korea issue is also bipartisan in the sense that everything we have tried, from George Herbert Walker Bush to Bill Clinton to George W. Bush to Barack Obama, has not worked, as measured by, and now Donald Trump, as measured by North Korea's nuclear program, which, although North Korea did not launch missiles or test nuclear weapons after Donald Trump met with Kim Jong-un, the fact is they continued expanding their arsenal and their capabilities and their missile technology and their fissile material and weapons. So this is the hardest problem in Asia in some ways. And I do not think Joe Biden will go right for a summit. I don't think he'll spend his political capital on it, but I also think his people realize that what Donald Trump achieved was symbolically very interesting, but substantively not progress, because the North Koreans have now, since 2012, in their constitution, said they are a nuclear weapon state. They're not going back, they say. So there's no silver bullet. There's no easy fix. It's really a frustrating incremental problem of risk mitigation, and a lot of small steps that are not glamorous but are important, like strengthening sanctions, strengthening deterrence, working with Japan, of course, working with Korea, and finding ways to work with China, but not by going to China asking for their help, because the Chinese don't want to deal with this issue either. They want to put it on the back burner. So you get the Chinese to pay attention by demonstrating how strong our alliances are with Korea and Japan. And so I hope and I expect the Biden administration's early play on diplomacy is actually going to be to demonstrate a united front with Korea, of course, with Japan, but also with Australia and Canada in that region, with Europe. And then you go to the Chinese, and then you go to the North Koreans. That's the play. It's not glamorous, it's laborious, and it's at best got a marginal chance of success, but it positions you to deal with the North Koreans, whatever they do. And that's sort of where we are. I think 90% of North Korea, people who've worked on this country, that's kind of where they are. That's all there is we can do.
Yeah, and I would just add to Mike's very good points, a couple of, I think, tenets just to tease out what he said. I view I am a pragmatist on this, right? There are folks in this sphere, although they've fallen off more and more over time, who used to be hard and fast ideologues on a certain approach. I think so. I am a pragmatist, and I think more and more of the North Korea community that watches this and does policy work and writing around it is becoming more and more pragmatic for precisely some of the reasons Mike talked about. And generally speaking, my assessment is that the data tend to support the North comes to the table when they're under some sort of pressure, and there is a viable diplomatic option, right? And you have to generate sufficient leverage to get them interested in coming to the table, unless the only other the sort of the corollary to that theory is there's a huge bag of goodies for free, right? There's no cost and there's a high amount of rewards. And I think that latter option is less and less palatable to many in Washington, and I would argue to many in other capitals who are involved in this as well. But there's some debate around that last point. But having said that, I do think that it's important to, while you keep the door wide open to diplomacy, you essentially look at your economic, political, and your military elements to try to put some pressure. And I'm not advocating a strike by any means. I'm just saying the posture and presence you have in the region is very important and a sign to Pyongyang. The other piece too that Mike alluded to earlier is the Seoul-Tokyo relationship. Because when Seoul and Tokyo have a reasonable working relationship and are relatively aligned, it does change the dynamic geopolitically in the region. And that's an important element too, as well, that I think Mike, it was in his bullets, but I just wanted to unpack as well. And the final thing I would say is then in all of that, we come back to the inter-Korean versus denuclearization piece. So getting those, I would say those three big pillars, get an idea of where you want to go on those points, strong consultation with your allies, alignment there, right? And effectuating that game plan, I think is critical. And the final point I'll say is just coming back to what I said at the outset, whereas I do tend to think that the North Koreans are under pressure. The model is under stress. And there's a whole host of data to support it. I point to the fact that for the first time really ever, although I guess there was kind of a smaller example of this in 2003, the North Koreans issued a bond, right, to their own people, right? That is something that is significant, right, in terms of symbol of what's going on and the need to get cash out of the informal economy within North Korea. That's an indicator. So there's a host of those that we could run through, but that all augurs to me like that's the basic framework, right, which is the three elements that I talked about, the North Koreans under pressure, and then flexible, engaged, smart diplomacy to see where we can get, recognizing that this is not going to be something that's solved in a month or a year, but is more likely a phased program over a long period of time that has, different, probably incorporates a freeze, some form of rollback, and then down the road, an end game, right, over a set of nuclear weapons. That would be, my best guess at a very, very difficult problem.
JP Shim anticipated your answer in his question, and he says the Biden and Moon administrations may have a disconnect where Biden will likely focus on deterrence, whereas Moon appears to be focusing on a end of war declaration. How do we square that? I mean, how do U.S. diplomats square that?
I guess what I would say on that is what we learned about from the summits, there's some data points, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think one of the takeaways from the summits is that the North really isn't all that interested in a end of war declaration. And I think generally speaking, most people who are pragmatists are open to it in some sort of sequence, but it's really what will drive the North. The North is really principally focused on sanctions relief at this point. And so I think that's the conversation, right, in terms of the Moon and Biden administrations about where we're going, probably centers around sanctions relief and or pressure to get the North to the table on that work. I think that's probably the first order. I would just add one other point to that, which is, I was on a seminar with a couple of really South Koreans who are very close to the Blue House, and essentially there is recognition that the North is not overly interested in talking right now. There is some of that, and I think that's what everybody is interested in, right? How can we get them back to the table in a meaningful way where we make actual progress on a whole host of issues that can build some momentum and work towards the shared goals we have as an alliance?
Mike, let me ask you this. This is from Rich Sanders, who's at the Wilson Center, and he says, should we be seeking North Korea's nuclear disarmament, or is that a lost cause? should we press instead for vigorous containment?
We should never give up on complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Never. Primarily because if we now say we give up and North Korea has a legitimate right to nuclear weapons, we open up proliferation doors we don't want to open. And we also significantly undermine, I mean, really undermine confidence in U.S. deterrence in Japan and to a significant extent in Korea. So there's no benefit to saying, we're just going to give up. We need to always have that as our North Star, so to speak, as our goal. The reality, as I said earlier, though, is that North Korea has cheated on every agreement it has ever signed for denuclearization. And that the North Koreans in 2012 made nuclear weapon status permanent under their constitution. So we have to be realistic about that. And so we have to be able to contain the problem with the sanctions regime. And Mark and I haven't mentioned this yet, but also in terms of stopping outward proliferation. The North Koreans in 2007 were caught exporting, they helped the Syrians build a nuclear reactor at El Kibar, in Syria, which the Israeli Air Force helpfully blew up for us, killing North Korean engineers inside. The North Koreans threatened, I was in the negotiations with the North Koreans from 2002 to 2005. And I was there when they told us that they threatened to transfer nuclear capability if we didn't give in to their demands. And that was 4 years before El Kibar, before they did transfers, not fissile material, not weapons, but help the Syrians start building a reactor. So we have to be vigilant and have strong containment of outward proliferation. It's a heavy burden, but we've got to do it. And then the question is, where's the space for some diplomacy? And, Mark said it's around a freeze. I think that's right. The challenge is the North Koreans would like to get us to agree to a freeze of the stuff we can see, which is their Yongbyon plutonium reactor complex, which you can monitor from space and the air, but not on their uranium enrichment, which is under caves and we can't see it. So they want to rent to us in exchange for sanctions lifting, saying they're not bad guys, legitimacy. They want to rent to us a freeze of the stuff we can see, no access to the stuff we can't see, and no promise they won't cheat once again. So yes, the way forward is something around a freeze, but man, is that a tough thing to sell to Congress or the American people or our allies. So we may initially be looking at even smaller ball. Let's see if we can do humanitarian assistance, some confidence building. It's pretty small stuff. And let's back up South Korea. Let's support North-South dialogue, not when it comes to things, in my view, like a peace treaty or the nuclear stuff, but family reunions, confidence building. Let's completely back up Seoul and put the onus on North Korea to respond to the South Koreans, our allies.
Mark, does the COVID crisis in North Korea open some avenues of pressure, or is there some way to take advantage of that? Asks Stuart Hicken.
Yeah, I do. I tend to think it is built up. It's almost, let me put it this way. Well, first, on Mike's point, I think Mike makes some really good points. I think what I was just I was giving an overview, kind of a framework. We can get really into the tactics here, right? And that's when you start asking people like these North Korea experts at the bottom of the hour, which way do North Korean submarines crazy Ivan? There are people out this anyway. So on the question on COVID, I would just say, yes, I do. And I do think it's because essentially the North Koreans have self-sanctioned in a very effective way their own economy, upping the pressure for sanctions relief, humanitarian aid, and hence dialogue with one of the major actors who can give them that.
Mike Green, will the role of U.S. forces in Korea change in a Biden administration? As Jiang Yang Lee.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, Mark worked on this more recently in the Pentagon than I did. I think not too much, but even though President Trump is not going to be there to sign a peace treaty with North Korea and announce he's pulling troops out, There's still budget pressure. There's still going to be some questions growing over time about why we have troops in Korea that are only for one mission, dealing with North Korea. You know, wouldn't it be better off to have troops rotate in from the United States or Hawaii, you know, or from the United States, from Hawaii, California, Washington State, Alaska, rotate in so we have flexibility to use them in other contingencies? I think those voices will grow. And it's awkward for Seoul because Seoul's not in a position to say, yeah, take troops from the Korean Peninsula, use them anywhere you want, because that would undermine the Korean people's confidence. So so those kinds of debates will grow. I think the way to head them off, personally, is for the South Korean government to say, we can do a lot to help stabilize Asia before you actually have to use U.S. troops in Korea. We can do a lot in development assistance. We can do a lot in technology. We can help countries like Vietnam develop a Samsung 5G network and not rely on China. Seoul is in fact doing a lot, but has been hesitant to frame it that way because they don't want to get crosswise with Beijing. But that kind of discussion, I do think, is coming, even though we've dodged a bullet in terms of the president of the United States precipitating it. It is still going to be on the table, I think.
Last point, if I could just make one quick, I know we're out of time, about a 15-second intervention here. I worry very little about the military posture moves because we have a long history of doing it. We have a long history of adapting them, and we have the most structured part of the alliance in terms of what's called the MCM, the SCM. I won't go through the acronyms, but just say there's a robust structure to bilaterally discuss those changes, and the key is to make sure it's a bilateral conversation, not a unilateral conversation, and that likelihood has gone way up with President-elect Biden coming into office in January.
Okay, Ambassador Lippert, my last question goes to you. Have you received a call from the Biden transition team?
Well, I'm here to discuss my son's here right here, by the way. I'm being totally distracted all at once. Sejin, who has a Korean name. All right, Sejin, come on. The answer is, like, I'm not, you're into Washington silly season here. The important thing is that the U.S. ROK alliance is strong, robust, and well-positioned into the 21st century. That's what I'm here to talk about here today.
That's great. Well, that was the last word. I want to thank you, Ambassador Mark Lippert and Dr. Michael Green. It's been a terrific and really meaty conversation. I want to thank you both, and we'll put this video on YouTube, and hopefully the experts will be poring over it, or they will if they're smart. I want to thank the Consulate General of Korea in Atlanta and the Atlanta Global Studies Center for sponsoring this program. We've got upcoming programs. I've got to do a little advertising here. Next Thursday, November 19th, we have Michelle Nunn, the CEO of CARE, and Suni Babu, the Chief of Party of the Bihar Technical Support Team of CARE India, talking about innovation in healthcare in the developing world. On Tuesday, November 24th, we've got an amazing program, Overlooked America, Building Jobs and Tech Skills, with former Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez. I want to urge everybody to please join the World Affairs Council. We need your support so we can keep bringing programs like this to you. I want to send out a special thanks to Lee Kwang-suk, the Deputy Consul General of Korea, who's worked with me on putting this program together. Fernanda Lucchini, our Executive Director at the World Affairs Council. Valerin Lopez DeFrank, who is the producer of this show. I hope to see you all on Thursday, a week from today, with Michelle Nunn. Thank you very much, Mike and Mark. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mike.